Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Claire. I'm a contract librarian on assignment here with NOAA Central Library. This seminar series is offered through the NOAA Central Library Seminar Program, which provides an educational forum for the presentation of ideas, research updates, and news in support of NOAA's mission. Before we start, I have a few technical tips for attendees. Just so you are aware, you are muted and you are not able to unmute. However, if you have a question, you can type it into the question panel. We'll get to those during the Q&A session at the end of the presentation. If you're having any audio or visual issues, if you can't hear the speaker or see the slides, please try logging off and logging back on. That will solve most issues in GoToWebinar. As a reminder, this is being recorded. If you'd like to revisit this seminar or view previous seminars in this series, you can find them on our YouTube channel. Now I'm going to turn it over to Jen, who's going to get the presentation started.
Thank you, Claire. Hi, everybody. This is Jenn Fagan-Fry. I think looking at who's here, all of you know me, but those who don't, I am the NOAA Institutional Repository Manager within the Central Library in Silver Spring. I also do a lot with scholarly communications and publishing. So today we are going to talk about open access. Sort of understanding and navigating open access and what that means within the federal sort of workforce. So I am just going to jump right in. And as Claire mentioned, we'll have time for questions at the end. So feel free to add those into the chat and into the question panel as well. So to start, let's just real basic, what is open access? Open access is free, unrestricted access to research outputs. Specifically, when we're talking about open access, we're talking about peer-reviewed literature, whether that's print-based literature or most aptly online. And usually open access for peer-reviewed articles and publications is achieved through open licensing, which we'll get to in just a second. So don't worry, I'll explain what that means. When we talk about open access, there's a couple different kinds, but there's two main kinds. So typically we're looking at either gold open access, which means that a publication, again, we're focusing on like journal articles, is fully and immediately available via a publisher's website. It's free to readers, regardless of their subscription status. So you need to access a journal article, you have to have a subscription to that journal. If you've published something gold open access, it means you don't have to have that subscription to access and read and download that article. Typically, though, with gold open access, the author is charged a fee to publish at that level. So this is usually called an APC or an article processing charge. And we can talk a little bit more about that in a few minutes. There is an option for open access that does not require an APC, and that is called diamond or platinum level access. So that means it is fully open access for readers. People can download, share, read those items, but it's also free for the authors. They do not have to pay an APC. Diamond/platinum OA journals are incredibly rare and very difficult to get into for obvious reasons. So most open access items go through a gold open access route. However, there's a second route, and this is the route that we're going to talk a lot about today as well, is green open access. This is also sometimes referred to as self-archiving. So this means that the open access version that you're posting is going to be within an institutional repository or on you, the author's personal website. So for green open access, there is no APC for the author. However, readers are still, other scientists, researchers, readers are going to need a subscription to view that version of record, typically. So what we're, or VOR here. So what we're talking about is we're not archiving the publisher's version, the version of record, we're archiving the accepted manuscript, or sometimes that's called the post-refereed version. Those two terms are kind of interchangeable, but they refer to the same document. So there's sort of two documents that you have here. With the gold open access, you can do whatever with the publisher's version. When we're talking about green open access, we're talking about the author's manuscript, the accepted manuscript version that we're making open and accessible. So that brings up the question, right? If you have these two paths, do we APC? As Thor says, you'll pay for that. I mean, there are fees associated with it. So to get those immediate benefits, you have to pay for things, right? So with that fee, you're making the item open so readers can access it. But what you're really sort of paying for is the licensing. So I had mentioned earlier that this is done through open licensing, and typically this open licensing is done through Creative Commons. It's, as you can see here, sort of a standardized way to grant the public permission to use creative works under copyright law. And we'll get to copyright again in a minute. So there are a couple different kinds. I'm not going to go through these in super detail. We have done another open access presentation. The recording is on the YouTube channel where I went into a lot in depth about Creative Commons licenses. But whenever we talk about open access, I would be remiss not to sort of cover the basics of Creative Commons licenses. On this slide, you can see these are sort of the three of them. There's, I think, 6 or 7 in total, and we'll go through all of them. But you can see here I'm not sure if you can see my mouse, but you'll see here that there is a kind of badge, we'll call it, that goes with each of these. So the first type of license and the most open and most accessible is the CC BY, which means you have to give credit to the author, but it allows distribution, remixing, adapting, building upon. There's commercial use available for these items. CC BY is sort of the biggest and most open of all of the licenses. And then as we move through the rest of this list, you'll see certain restrictions start to come into play. So for the CC BY SA, derivatives must be shared alike. So you have to, if you do a derivative of an item, you have to share it as a CC BY. And then we have NC, that means non-commercial. So only commercial use of that work is permitted. NCSA, non-commercial share alike. ND means no derivatives, no adaptations of that. And then one of the really common ones that you'll see, and a lot of gold open access publishers tend to use this particular Creative Commons license, CC BY NC-ND, which is the non-commercial, non-derivative. So when you're paying your APC, typically you're going to wind up with usually one of 2 licenses. It's either going to be that full CC BY, or most publishers will opt for a CC BY NC-ND. So those are sort of the 2 main licenses, but there's variations and iterations in between. So something to keep in mind as you are working through the process. When you are negotiating with a publisher, so when you're in the process of publishing and talking to them about your work and you opt to go and pay the APC for the open access, talk to them about your license options and what they have available, how that may change that APC price. Depending on the license, there may be a price difference. Maybe not. It depends. That's a publisher by publisher sort of thing. And it could even be title by title. So one AMS title may have one fee for one license, but another AMS title may have a different fee for the same license. It's something you'd have to talk to the publisher about. And then you can use that information plus what you think is best for your work. As a librarian and given, open access mandates through the PARR plan and things of that nature, we always recommend if you're able to do the full CC BY, it means it's the most open and it means it's the most accessible. So, so that's sort of the first route if we want to go with an APC. Or we could choose to APC. So the green route is really, I don't want to pay this fee, but I want to ensure that I can make my publication as open and accessible as possible. How would we go about doing that? Through posting or archiving your accepted manuscripts. So I thought this would be a good place to sort of talk about what exactly do we mean by an accepted manuscript. So this is the version of the manuscript that's created after peer review by the publisher, but it doesn't include any publisher content. So we don't have page numbers. We shouldn't have logos, publisher logos. The formatting looks a little rough. This version of the document, the author still holds all the rights to this version of the manuscript. And this is the version that we ask for when we talk about we need a manuscript for the repository. This is the version we're talking about. This is the version and what we're referring to for green open access. So I had done a webinar back in, I think it was May, where we covered a lot about manuscripts, different versions, what they looked like. And one of the things that was in that webinar was this graphic that I derived from an article that's linked here in this, and it's also linked on the Scholarly Communications and Publications Guide that we have. This briefly, just this graphic sort of shows kind of ownership of a publication, of an article. Sort of it shows how an item will move from your submitted manuscript through to the accepted manuscript, where galley proofs and proof copies come into play, and then ultimately your version of record, or VOR, the publisher's version is what that is. So, you know, the accepted manuscript, as I have highlighted here, this is the version that we most often want or need if the item is not open access. This is what we're using for green open access. So just to provide a little bit more context and another example, it's not the greatest picture, so I apologize, but here's sort of a picture of an item we have in the repository. I put the link in there so you can look at it if you'd like to. What an accepted manuscript looks like. You can see it even has the manuscript line numbers on here. It doesn't really have any fancy formatting. It's pretty bare bones. It looks really similar to a submitted manuscript in terms of the format, but it does have those edits that were it has the edits included that were put forth by the reviewers. All of that's been incorporated into this. And then this is the format that's sent back to the publisher. And then the next version is what's usually a galley proof or a proof version or a copy editing version. Sometimes, depending on the publisher, they name it different things all the time. So this is what we're talking about when we're talking about an accepted manuscript. So that seems easy enough to identify. But what about identifying open access articles, right? Like it seems simple. Like I can hear people going, Jen, this is easy. Like it just says open access on it, right? Like, but it can get kind of complicated and it can get confusing. And there's some weird things that some publishers do that can make it really complicated and very confusing, especially for readers and authors. So what I thought we would do is just go through a couple examples of articles. These are things that, again, are in the institutional repository and things that have been submitted to us. So this is a PLOS open access article. Obviously, everything in PLOS is open access. It's the Public Library of Open Science. So all of these have some sort of Creative Commons license. But what I've done here is sort of indicators on this document that show you this is an open access thing. You can see the lock and the open access at the top, but also I highlighted the copyright statement with the copyright 2016 with the author's first name et al. And then it goes into telling you exactly which Creative Commons license this is published under, which is a CC BY. So when you click on that hyperlink there, it'll take you to Creative Commons and say this is a CC BY publication and let you know what your permissions are with that particular license. So this is another way. Elsevier sort of indicates their open access status a little bit differently. You can see it's at the very bottom of the first page of the article, but you can see they just have a really brief sentence that says this is an open access article under the CC BY NC/ND license. And again, it links to Creative Commons so that you can see what all those permissions, what that means. Here, instead of putting authors' names, they put copyright 2020, the authors. That's pretty common too. It's usually a mix of one or the other. It'll either say the authors or it will say something like the first author's name et al., something along those lines. The next one, again, it looks pretty similar, but this one actually put the badge on there for the CC license, and it's sorted down here at the bottom. This is something from MDPI, which again, we know is a fully open access publisher with an A, and on here, it again gives you the copyright 2020 by the authors, but you have the badge up here, and then you also have the link to the Creative Commons license, so you can check that. Again, I know you're all thinking, yeah, that's pretty obvious, Jen. That seems silly to sort of go over it. But then I'm going to bring up something that is not as easy to tell and really throws sort of a monkey wrench in the idea of open access. And that's what will sometimes pop up on articles called free or full access. As you can see, these are 3 different publishers. All of them sort of highlight this in a different way. And for most people, you would think, oh, okay, it says full access. That must mean the same thing as open access. It does not. It's actually quite different. When something is labeled as free or full access, this is something that's put in by editors, by the publisher. And what it essentially is saying is that this article is open in that anyone can read it. You can go there to the publisher's website and read that article on the publisher's website, but you can't download it. You can't share it. You couldn't redistribute it. When we see something with this full access, that's not a version we can use in the institutional repository. This is just an indication saying this is a free read version. You can read it. You got to stay on our website though. You can't do anything else. You can read it on our website, and that's it. So the question is why would a publisher do this? Why would they make that distinction? It drives traffic a little bit. It'll drive traffic to the publisher's website. And then if it is an article that you're really interested in and you do want to download it, then you'll be at their site so you can pay for it if you don't already have subscription access to it. So it is a way to sort of, you can't see my air quotes because I don't have my camera on, but to make something open access, hence my winking here, without really making it open access. It's readable, it's accessible, but only to a certain point. So that's why I kind of wanted to spend some time talking about identifying open access. I know the free and full access throws people off, and honestly, sometimes it even catches us off guard ourselves, especially when it is a publication in a journal that we actually subscribe to. So then we have to really do some additional digging to make sure it is the version we can use. So with all of that discussion, I also wanted to take a minute and sort of talk about the version of record and open access and how those 2 things play together and what it means, and how the version of record plays into open access. So obviously the version of record is that publisher's version that you download, that publisher's PDF that you download from their website. That's what the DOI for that article is always going to point to, is that publisher's version. If an item is published as open access, so that gold open access with any of those Creative Commons licenses, we can archive that version of record. That is part of those CC licenses, to use that and archive that. So like in the institutional repository or on your author website, you can use that version. Sometimes that version of record can be archived in, say, the institutional repository, even if your item is not open access. So a couple examples, and we talked about this back in May during that big manuscripts webinar that I did. AMS is a good example, or AGU. There is a bit of an embargo period. So after 6 months, though, we can archive that version of record in the institutional repository. We can take that publisher's version. We wouldn't necessarily need the manuscript version. But that's only certain publishers. Certain publishers and certain titles permit us to do that, which is why we always say it's best just to send us your your accepted manuscript, because then we are able to, then we can always check on permissions through the publisher and make sure we're using the right version. If we have the accepted manuscript and we can't use the publisher's version, we're good to go. We have the accepted manuscript. If you send us the version of record, but we need the manuscript, then we have to contact you back. And then we have that discourse back and forth until you can finally get us the manuscript version. So the other thing I want to bring up in conjunction with these two things is part of open access, and especially in regards to the version of record, is about redistribution rights. So when something is marked as open access through those CC licenses, what it's saying is there is some redistribution rights afforded to that document, which that means putting it into the institutional repository. We have the right to do that and the ability to do that. Those items that are marked as free access or full access, they don't have the same redistribution rights. Hence, those are read-only sorts of, again, air quotes, you can't see, open access. So I wanted to sort of make that distinction because it plays into, as always, all of this plays into copyright, right? Copyright is inevitable, and we always wind up talking about copyright and permissions, and we are federal employees or working, you know, on the government's dime, right? Like, how can these things apply to us? There's a bunch of rules behind all of it. So again, back in May, we went into a lot of this in depth, but that idea of redistribution is what is the real key and crux of all of this when it comes to what versions can we use and what that is based on copyright. I want to make a brief sort of segue and side note about preprints. I wasn't quite sure where to throw this in, but I thought this was as good a place as any. I wanted to talk briefly about preprints. I think everyone's pretty aware of what preprints are, but just in case you aren't, preprints are essentially the version of a submitted manuscript that has not been peer reviewed. It has not been submitted at that point, essentially. You have not submitted anything to a journal. There has not been any review on it. So it is a preprint. There are a number of preprint servers. The number of servers is growing exponentially. There's a lot of movement in it. I wanted to highlight within NOAA and per our scientific integrity policy, the NAO, NOAA authors are not to disseminate their research on preprint servers or in predatory journals. And that's a bit of a different issue. I don't have anything about predatory journals in this particular presentation, but if you have questions, please drop them into the question panel and we can answer those. We'll have plenty of time for questions. So if you have predatory journal questions, please add those in. So just as a reminder, this is a newer change to the scientific integrity policy, but NOAA does not want folks to put their research on preprint servers. So just as a side note. So back to OA a little bit. Why does open access matter? Obviously, I'm going to tell you it matters because we have to do it because of the OSTP mandate, the NOAA PARR plan. But there's a ton of other reasons why open access matters, and not just because we have to, which is always the easiest answer, but there's a ton of great reasons and a lot of benefit to authors. So the arrows are in here in this order for a very specific reason. Essentially, open access means that there's more access to your research, and it's free. It's free to more people. So the more people who can access it means your research has more visibility, more eyes on it because of this additional access. So the more access means more eyes, which means more citations. You're going to get more citations on your items. There's a number of studies that have been done that show if you publish something open access, whether it's green or gold, you're going to wind up with more citations because of that visibility and the easier access. More citations means greater impact. We all want our research to be super impactful. So if you have more accessible, more people are seeing it, it's going to have a bigger impact. That's all there is to it. It's pretty simple. But because you have that bigger impact, that can and often does lead to more collaborations and new collaborations, which is really key to moving science forward, right? And on top of that, collaborating with more and new colleagues means that there's greater representation. You can connect with new people with different viewpoints from different places. And that means we have more representation. Increasing representation in the field is a good thing, which sort of leads to kind of the impetus for focusing on open access this month was about representation. And excuse me, October is the home of Open Access Week. So Open Access Week is October 25th through the 31st. And why I have this here is because this week, this year, the theme for Open Access Week is all about diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility, specifically building structural equity. So, but what does that mean, right? Like what does DE&I mean in terms of open access, and why is it important? The obvious reason is, or the obvious link here, right, is if it's open access, more people can access it. It brings in, when your work is open access, it brings in more eyes, which brings in more diversity. So, and allows for greater impact overall, right? So sort of going back to that previous slide or two previous slides. However, the theme this year, right, is about sort of building structural equity. And what does that mean? So a lot of that would mean we need to increase the number of underrepresented authors in open access journals. We're talking about removing biases within the peer review process to ensure that it's equitable, identifying and mitigating barriers to open access. And this is key specifically for LMICs, which is low and middle income countries, specifically like the global south, is typically what people are talking about when we're talking about LMICs. But it's identifying, which often are those APC charges. And how do we mitigate those to make sure that things are more equitable for those underserved and underrepresented populations? And also, this last point sort of goes to these two things I have linked down here that sort of fall a little bit more on publishers, but I think, authors should be aware of this as well. Doing more research and publishing more research on racism, inequalities, equity, underserved and underrepresented groups, and how all that ties into our research. So the two things I have linked here, one is a blog post from the Scholarly Kitchen that talks about this exact issue and how, what the scholarly community sort of, how they need to kind of reimagine what the publishing and how to incorporate these things. And then I also wanted to provide a publisher's example. PLOS has a whole page, a whole website, essentially, dedicated to their diversity, equity, and inclusion goals. This links directly to the statement, and then they have regular updates. I think they're quarterly on their progress on all of these DE&I goals that I thought was interesting to see that this is something that the publishing community is working towards. So with that, I kind of blew through that really fast. With that, I'm going to move to the last slide, but then I think we'll have plenty of time for questions. Just again, the typical shameless self-promotion plug. Our next webinar in the series is going to be on 508 compliance. Jan Thomas, one of our fantastic librarians with the College Park Library, will be doing that. Jan, most of you may know Jan through, he handles a lot of the NOAA IR submissions. We will have the link for you after today, so you'll want to check back on that, but we'll have the registration link for that, and you can see here the topics we're going to sort of cover. And just the basic refreshers of 508 and why it matters, but we'll spend a bulk of the time talking about guidelines for NOAA IR submissions, how the libraries can help you. And then we want folks to submit questions. They can be technical, they could be policy. Any questions are welcome or related to 508. Shoot them to us. There's a form here. I think Claire can also drop the form into the chat for us. Please submit your questions. We'd like to build this webinar around actually answering what big issues are you guys having? What tricky things are you running into, so we can address it? Because if you're running into the issue, I'm certain someone else is. So with that, I'm going to stop talking for a minute and we will see if there are any questions, if there's any of these areas that you'd like me to sort of revisit. I don't see anything in the question panel, so I'm assuming nobody had any questions. And I don't see much in the chat. So I'm going to assume people are furiously typing things into the chat and or the questions. And while y'all do that, I am going to drop in the link for the next webinar, that Google form link for you all for the next webinar. I will toss in here also that we will be doing some Open Access Week emails from the library. There's probably just going to be 1 or 2 of them. And those will be coming out the week of the 25th. So you'll probably see something Monday or Tuesday just about open access in general, and then another email with a bunch of resources in there. Again, I don't see any questions. And I did drop in the link. So I will hang on for another minute or so, but if not, I guess I will just say thank you to everyone who joined us today. Oh, thank you, Claire. I'm sorry. All right, well, again, I don't have questions, so I hope everyone found it informative, and hopefully we will see you next month on the 18th at 2 p.m. Same bat time, same bat channel, and that next month you get to listen to someone other than my voice. You can hear Jan talk. So with that, I guess we'll close it out. Thanks everybody for coming, and I hope you all have a great rest of the day.